In other words, why should I leap to a supernatural conclusion from a chain of natural causation?
We read Summa Contra Gentiles, book 1, and one of the arguments presented was the unmoved mover argument. I know you've discussed this before, but yeah, so briefly the argument is like, observe that everything in the universe that is moving is moved by something else, and there cannot be an infinite regress in external movers, therefore there must be some being outside the universe that's the original unmoved mover, right?
Yeah.
I was just wondering if like it seems like a good argument to me, but I was wondering what you thought about it.
Right. So we've done a lot of podcasts covering this. And there's different ways why it's not a good argument. So let me pull up one of the ways, let's see, where we critique this. We did, I think probably the best one would be the theistic fallacies talk that we did. So I'm going to put that in the chat for you guys right there. And then if you want the specifics, the chat, the video is called Theistic Fallacies, Why Natural Theology is a Failed Project. So again, there's a lot of different ways to go about critiquing and explaining why the unmoved mover argument really isn't a very good argument. And just to list a few of the reasons that I think it's not a very good argument is that it operates on an older view of the ancient and medieval thinkers that there's self-evident truths. So number one, if there are not self-evident truths, then the argument's not going to work. If there are self-evident truths, we need to know why they are self-evident and on what grounds you argue that. And as soon as you start to argue why it's self-evident and on what grounds, as soon as you start giving grounds, it's no longer self-evident. And most of the time, the people who argue for self-evident truths, if you watch the debate with Trent Horn that I did, really the debate hinges on that, right? So we end up debating epistemology issues. And so the first point is that the ancient and medieval world didn't do their philosophy first in terms of epistemology. They started with metaphysics. And so if you know the course of philosophy, the way it went, by the modern period, people start asking questions about metaphysical assumptions, and thus the shift goes to epistemology. So if you want to have an adequate answer to the atheists of the last 500 years, we're going to have to answer their challenges to our epistemic assumptions. Because the whole of the argument of the first mover just hinges on the metaphysical assumptions of Aristotle's system. Okay, but what happens when somebody comes along and questions whether on Aristotle's system itself you can have a self-evident kind of self-referential, basic doxicality when it comes to the starting points of the system, right? So, for example, one of the things in Aristotle's epistemology is that we can have a distinction between that which is known to us and that which is known to itself, better in itself. But that distinction is not something that is necessarily self-evident. So how are we supposed to know? And by the way, Aristotle's whole epistemology is built on the idea that there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses. But that proposition itself, that there's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses, is not something that you can see in sense data. So the proposition is self-refuting on Aristotle's grounds. Now, none of this means that I'm rejecting metaphysics or causality, or that there is a, quote, first cause. It means that they don't have an argument when it comes to explaining why we should accept those first principles. And this is why you have to know epistemology and deal with the epistemic questions if we want to have adequate answers to today's atheists. It doesn't work to just repeat medieval arguments, ignoring the questions and the challenges of atheism in the last 500 years. And that's precisely what probably 95% of Thomists and Roman Catholic apologists do, is they just ignore all these challenges and questions of the last 500 years and assume a very naive kind of foundationalist epistemology. So in other words, everything that is contained in the assumptions of the unmoved mover argument hinges on a certain metaphysics, a certain kind of foundationalist epistemology, and it hinges on a kind of natural theology, which if you're a biblical divine revelation based theist isn't the case. Furthermore, there's logical problems as well in the unmoved mover argument. For one, this is a logical and a metaphysical problem. Aristotle's argument is based on Aristotle's conception of God. Aristotle's conception of God is as an eternal first actualizer. So that means that for him to be who he is, or to be what it is, to be more properly, it means that there's always matter that it has to move or actualized. There's never a time when there was never a movement by the unmoved mover. So that means that it's incompatible with the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And that's why modern Thomists like Ed Feser explicitly say we're going to have to give up the doctrine of creation ex nihilo and just argue for an eternally moved matter. Okay, well, that's not the Christian worldview. That's a dualistic pagan worldview, because as St. Basil says in Hexameron 2, if God is an unmoved mover or an eternal actualizer, then he must always actualize something other than himself. So that requires an eternal moving of something else, prima materia, the heavens, whatever it is, and Aristotle contradicts himself on that, right? These are all just retarded arguments, dude. Does that make sense or not?
Yeah, that helps a lot. I'm gonna have to listen to that again.
Well, more appropriate than that would be the talk that we did, Theistic Fallacies, Why Natural Theology is a Failed Project. And if you go and read the paper by Dr. Garraby, I mean, he lays out strict logical argumentation as to why, God is not, our God is not Aristotle's God. So it doesn't make sense to copy and paste an Aristotelian argument that presupposes an Aristotelian kind of deity into our system. Doesn't mean that we don't believe in a first mover. But if you read, for example, the 200 chapters of St. Maximus, in the first 5 pages, he says that there's a sense in which God is an unmoved mover and a sense in which he's not. And he says that we can't take God to be an unmoved mover in terms of the essence of God itself. Well, that's precisely how the Roman Catholics define, especially the Thomists, in terms of their absolute divine simplicity doctrine. That's how they define God, as in his essence, first cause or unmoved mover. Well, that would mean eternal creation. Maximus says that God is first cause only in relation to the created order and not in himself. Okay, so in that sense, yeah, God's the creator of the universe, and that's how he's a first cause. But Basil just mocks this and says that this is dualism. Okay, well, dualism is not a Christian view. Okay, that's Manichaeanism, that's Gnosticism, to teach dualism. So why people want to combine this dumb argument with Christian apologetics is beyond me, because even Scripture itself says in Hebrews that by faith we know that the worlds were created out of nothing, right? It also says in Maccabees that the world was created out of nothing. So that's creation ex nihilo, is the doctrine of divine revelation says it's created out of nothing. Right? So how are we going to look at the created order and come to the conclusion that by reasoning back there would be some first cause? Furthermore, why do I have to accept that there's a single first cause? Maybe there's multiple first causes. I mean, if you read Aristotle, he contradicts himself, because he actually at times says that there's multiple first causes, but at other times he says there's a first cause. So which one is it? And on what basis are we supposed to know that, oh, well, it's only one single divine first cause? Okay, what if I think that, like David Hume says, it's just the great pumpkin at the beginning of the causal chain? In other words, why should I leap to a supernatural conclusion from a chain of natural causation? In other words, that's a non sequitur. Okay, so there's a series of causes going back, but you want me to accept that it's logical on what basis to just jump to a supernatural first cause? Maybe it's a purely natural first cause. Why should I accept a supernatural first cause? In other words, the cosmological argument assumes the thing that it's trying to prove, a supernatural first cause. In other words, it's like saying, if you grant me my Christian presuppositions about causation, I can prove to you that there's a first cause. But the atheist is questioning the Christian presuppositions and interpretation of causation. In other words, it's contained, as Hume says, within the argument itself that there's a supernatural first cause. And hence, if I recall, Hume makes the great pumpkin argument. if I see a bunch of pumpkins and I know that they came from another pumpkin, do I reason back to at some point there was the great pumpkin? If that's not the case, then on what basis should I conclude from a series of purely natural causes that there's a supernatural cause? And yet every person using this argument is trying to appropriate it to prove a supernatural first cause. So it's a non sequitur, and it's assuming the thing that it's trying to prove. Furthermore, you can't reason from the fact that because there is, Garraby talks about this fallacy in his paper, because there are a bunch of causes, therefore there is one super great cause, right? So on what basis can you reason to the fact that a bunch of causes lead you to a single cause? Oh, well, because you have to, because it's self-evident, right? I mean, they're going to go through a whole bunch of like just dumb arguments and non sequiturs as to why we're supposed to accept that. But just remember that all of these arguments are based on ancient and medieval foundationalist views, which nobody in those days really questioned. And it doesn't begin to be in question until the modern era. And even Aristotle himself says that, well, when it comes to first principles, you just kind of have to assume that they are the case. Okay, but the modern world doesn't do that. So it's not going to be useful in terms of answering their challenges to just say, well, but we should. Okay, but why? Right? And this is why epistemology matters. This is why, if you listen to the Trent debate, he contradicted himself precisely on this point. He says, there are self-evident truths, and they just are the case. And then he appeals to other things to ground them. And if you appeal to something else to ground something, then it's no longer self-evident. Now you have what's called the criteria problem. What is your criteria for your epistemic criteria? Yeah, you see, and this becomes just a big circle jerk.
All right, yeah, that's great. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Non sequitur. How do we know that things are just self-evident? I mean, in math, they sometimes say, clearly this, clearly that, but I guess that's somewhat different.
Well, but that's different because that's in a localized situation, a localized setting contained within a specific discipline. But what we're talking about here is all possible knowledge and worldviews as a whole. So that's why the argument shifts, and it's no longer about particular cases. It's about the possibility of knowledge at all. And that's what Tag is always dealing with, and this is why so many people have a hard time not you, but atheists, people grappling with the transcendental argument, is that the argument is necessarily going to shift because of the type of thing that we're arguing for. If we're arguing for a paradigm as a whole, you can't just appeal to everyday mundane instances and objects and things, or even mathematical objects, or a colloquial sense of self-evident, right, to explain the principles of knowledge themselves. And if you just say, let's talk about, I think it's Chisholm, right, who has the criteria problem. He says, look, let's say you believe in self-evident truths in this fundamental paradigm sense, okay, not in the sense of mathematics. Like if we say 1 + 1 = 2, and we say that's self-evident, right, we're just saying that there's an intuitive appearing of the truthfulness of that, right, and that's true. But when we're talking about paradigms as a whole and the possibility of knowledge at all, or the presuppositions of epistemology at all, that's a different case, because this is prior to the doing of any knowledge, right? This is prior to the doing of math problems. This is prior to the doing of empirical investigation. So it's going to be argued in a different way, right? And this is why it's a transcendental argument. If we ask a question like, how do we know logic is logical? How do we know logic works, right? How do we know it works in the world? Maybe it's just something that it works in our minds, but doesn't actually match up to the world. How do we know that? And so that's why the argument shifts to be a different kind of argument. And this is why we always talk about the crackers in the pantry fallacy, because a lot of people just assume that things are, in a naive kind of simplistic way, that everything's proven in the same way. Oh, you just look at the evidence and it proves it. Okay, but this is prior to evidential concerns. This is, how do we know that there's knowledge at all? How do we know that there's epistemology at all? How do we know that logic is logical at all? Okay, so these are more fundamental questions than empirical evidence kinds of questions. They are prior to empirical investigation. Does that mean they can't be investigated? No, it means that they aren't investigated and proven the same way as empirical things. That's all it means. So people get really confused with this. They get really lost in the weeds, not talking about you, but the people who grapple with this. But you're asking the right kinds of questions, so you're grappling with it, I think, in the correct way. So self-evidence, quote unquote, can be used in kind of a non-specific, non-technical sense to talk about math problems within the discipline of mathematics. But if we're talking about epistemology itself, which is prior to the doing of math, the possibility of knowledge at all, it's not going to work to just say, well, these things are self-evident and these aren't. And there's different ways to prove this, but one way to prove this is the Chisholm problem of criterion. So let's say that this is the case. Let's say that there are self-evident truths. What is the principle that you're going to use to identify the self-evident truths, list them out, and contrast them to the non-self-evident truths? Well, wouldn't the criteria itself be prior to the self-evident truths? So you see, that's now a contradiction.
Right, that's a good point.
This is the Chisholm problem.
I will look that up.
Yeah, it's a famous thing in epistemology where it's just talking about how you can't do epistemology without a prior idea of the criterion of justification for justified epistemology. But as soon as you have a criteria of justified epistemology, you're now in the box of the criterion problem, which is insoluble in any of these claimants to self-evident truths. That's it. That's all it's saying. So, in other words, all of those things, and by the way, there's more. There's more criticisms that you can make. Let's take, for example, the name of this fallacy is escaping me, but it's the fallacy of where you say, for example, we all come from a mother, right?
Yeah, I've heard this one.
Right. So therefore, we all come from the same mother. Every cause has an antecedent cause or preceding cause, right? Therefore, there's one cause.
Per se and per accidens or something.
Maybe
different kinds of chains of causality, per se, and I may have it wrong. But.
No, I'm trying. He lists the name of it. It has. I think I've got it in my notes. Let me see my phone notes from a few months ago. I haven't thought about causal chains and this kind of stuff in a few, 5 or 6 months. So the name of this fallacy escaped. If anybody's in the chat and remembers this fallacy, it's not genetics, not attribution. It's like it might be a parts whole, like a version of parts whole, because you're saying that because there's a bunch of causes, because specific instances have a single cause, then everything has a single cause. And while that may be the case, you can't just assert that without demonstrating why that is the case.
Right, it's sort of just like inductive argument, but
yeah,
even know induction is right in the first place.
That's true. Yeah, you could go with that human critique. I can't find my note on this, but I haven't. Let's see. Was it back in 2021? Here it is. I found it. I didn't list the name of it. That every effect has a cause, therefore all effects have a single cause. Now that may be the case, but you can't just assert that to be the case. Quantifier shift. Thank you very much, Light Tulpa. That's it. This is the quantifier shift fallacy. Everybody has a mother, therefore everyone has one and the same mother. Yes, quantifier shift fallacy. Thank you so much. But so, and I think you could apply that to the cosmological argument as well. So, does that make sense?
That was great. Yeah, that was great, Jay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Great questions.